Chapter 18. The Face at the Window. The events of the next day are completely hazy in my memory. I was unfortunate enough to awake with fever on me. I have been liable to these bouts of fever at inconvenient times ever since I once contracted malaria. In consequence, the events of that day take on in my memory the semblance of a nightmare, with Poirot coming and going as a kind of fantastic clown, making a periodic appearance in a circus. He was, I fancy, enjoying himself to the full. His poise of baffled despair was admirable. How he achieved the end he had in view, and which he had disclosed to me in the early hours of the morning, I cannot say, but achieve it he did. It cannot have been easy. The amount of deception and subterfuge involved must have been colossal. The English character is averse to lying on a wholesale scale, and that, no less, was what Poirot's plan required. He had first to get Dr. Graham converted to the scheme. With Dr. Graham on his side, he had to persuade the matron and some members of the staff of the nursing home to conform to the plan. There again, the difficulties must have been immense. It was probably Dr. Graham's influence that turned the scale. Then there was the chief constable and the police. Here Poirot would be up against officialdom. Nevertheless, he wrung at last an unwilling consent out of Colonel Weston. The colonel made it clear that it was in no way his responsibility. Poirot, and Poirot alone, was responsible for the spreading abroad of these lying reports. Poirot agreed. He would have agreed to anything, so long as he was permitted to carry out his plan. I spent most of the day dozing in a large armchair, with a rug over my knees. Every 2 or 3 hours or so, Poirot would burst in and report progress. "Comment ça va, mon ami? How I commiserate you. But it is as well, perhaps. The farce, you do not play it as well as I do. I come this moment from ordering a wreath immense, stupendous. Lilies, my friend, large quantities of lilies, with heartfelt regret, from Hercule Poirot. Ha! What a comedy!" He departed again. "I come from a most poignant conversation with Madame Rice," was his next piece of information. "Very well dressed in black, that one. Her poor friend, what a tragedy!" I groaned sympathetically. "Nick, she says, was so joyous, so full of life, impossible to think of her as dead. I agree. It is, I say, the irony of death that it takes one like that. The old and useless are left. Oh, la la!" I groan again. "How you're enjoying this," I murmured feebly. "Du tout. It is part of my plan, that is all. To play the comedy successfully, you must put the heart into it. Well, then, the conventional expressions of regret over, Madame comes to matters nearer home. All night she has lain awake wondering about those sweets. It is impossible. Impossible. Madame, I say, it is not impossible. You can see the analyst's report. Then she says, and her voice is far from steady, 'It was cocaine, you say.' I assent, and she says, 'Oh, my God, I do not understand.' Or perhaps that's true. She understands well enough that she is in danger. She is intelligent. I told you that before. Yes, she is in danger, and she knows it. And yet it seems to me that for the first time you don't believe her guilty." Poirot frowned. The excitement of his manner abated. "It is profound what you say there, Hastings. No, it seems to me that, somehow, the facts no longer fit. These crimes, so far, what has marked them most? The subtlety, is it not? And here is no subtlety at all, only the crudity, pure and simple. No, it does not fit." He sat down at the table. "Voila. Let us examine the facts. There are 3 possibilities. There are the sweets bought by Madame and delivered by Monsieur Lazarus. And in that case, the guilt rests with one or other or both. And the telephone call, supposedly from Mademoiselle Nick, that is an invention, pure and simple. That is the straightforward, the obvious solution. Solution 2, the other box of sweets, that which came by post. Anyone may have sent those. Any of the suspects on our list from A to J. You remember? A very wide field. But if that were the guilty box, what is the point of the telephone call? Why complicate matters with a second box?" I shook my head feebly. With a temperature of 102, any complication seemed to me quite unnecessary and absurd. Solution 3. A poisoned box was substituted for the innocent box bought by Madame. In that case, the telephone call is ingenious and understandable. Madame is to be what you call the kitten's paw. She is to pull the roasting chestnuts out of the fire. So, solution 3 is the most logical, but alas, it is also the most difficult. How to be sure of substituting a box at the right moment? The orderly might take the box straight upstairs. 101 possibilities might prevent the substitution being effected. No, it does not seem sense. Unless it were Lazarus, I said. Poirot looked at me. You have the fever, my friend. It mounts, does it not? I nodded. Curious how a few degrees of heat should stimulate the intellect. You have uttered there an observation of profound simplicity. So simple was it that I had failed to consider it. But it would suppose a very curious state of affairs. Monsieur Lazarus, the dear friend of Madame, doing his best to get her hanged. It opens up possibilities of a very curious nature, but complex, very complex. I closed my eyes. I was glad I had been brilliant, but I did not want to think of anything complex. I wanted to go to sleep. Poirot, I think, went on talking, but I did not listen. His voice was vaguely soothing. It was late afternoon when I next saw him. My little plan, it has made the fortune of flower shops, he announced. Everybody orders wreaths. Monsieur Croft, Monsieur Vyse, Commander Challenger. The last name awoke a chord of compunction in my mind. Look here, Poirot, I said. You must let him in on this. Poor fellow. He'll be distracted with grief. It isn't fair. You have always the tenderness for him, Hastings. Well, I like him. He's a thoroughly decent chap. You've got to take him into the secret. Poirot shook his head. No, mon ami. I do not make the exceptions. But you don't suspect him to have anything to do with it. I do not make the exceptions. Think how he must be suffering. On the contrary, I prefer to think of what a joyful surprise I prepare for him. To think the loved one dead and find her alive. It is a sensation unique. Stupendous. What a pig-headed old devil you are. He'd keep the secret all right. I am not so sure. He's the soul of honour, I'm certain of it. That makes it all the more difficult to keep a secret. Keeping a secret is an art that requires many lies magnificently told, and a great aptitude for playing the comedy and enjoying it. Could he dissemble the Commander Challenger? If he is what you say he is, he certainly could not. Well, then you won't tell him. I certainly refuse to imperil my little idea for the sake of the sentiment. It is life and death we play with, mon ami. Anyway, the suffering, it is good for the character. Many of your famous clergymen have said so, even a bishop, if I am not mistaken. I made no further attempt to shake his decision. His mind, I could see, was made up. I shall not dress for dinner, he murmured. I am too much the broken old man. That is my part, you understand. All my self-confidence has crashed. I am broken. I have failed. I shall eat hardly any dinner, the food untasted on the plate. That is the attitude, I think. In my own apartment, I will consume some brioche and some chocolate éclair, so called, which I had the foresight to buy at the confectioner's. Et vous? Some more quinine, I think, I said sadly. Alas, my poor Hastings. But courage, all will be well tomorrow. Oh, very likely. These attacks often last only 24 hours. I did not hear him return to the room. I must have been asleep. When I awoke, he was sitting at the table, writing. In front of him was a crumpled sheet of paper, smoothed out. I recognized it for the paper on which he had written that list of people, A to J, which he had afterwards crumpled up and thrown away. He nodded in answer to my unspoken thought. Yes, my friend, I have resurrected it. I am at work upon it from a different angle. I compile a list of questions concerning each person. The questions may have no bearing on the crime. They are just things that I do not know, things that remain unexplained, and for which I seek to supply the answer from my own brain. How far have you got? I have finished. Would you like to hear? You are strong enough? Yes, as a matter of fact, I'm feeling a great deal better. Ah, la bonne heure. Very well, I will read them to you. Some of them, no doubt, you will consider puerile. He cleared his throat. A. Ellen. Why did she remain in the house and not go out to see fireworks? Unusual, as Mademoiselle's evidence and surprise make clear. What did she think or suspect might happen? Did she admit anyone? Jay, for instance? To the house? Is she speaking the truth about the secret panel? If there is such a thing, why is she unable to remember where it is? Mademoiselle seems very certain there is no such thing, and she would surely know. If she invented it, why did she invent it? Had she read Michael Seaton's love letters, or was her surprise at Mademoiselle Nick's engagement genuine? B. Her husband. Is he as stupid as he seems? Does he share Ellen's knowledge, whatever it is, or does he not? Is he in any respect a mental case? C. The child. Is his delight in blood a natural instinct common to his age and development, or is it morbid? And is that morbidity inherited from either parent? Has he ever shot with a toy pistol? D. Who is Mr. Croft? Where does he really come from? Did he post the will as he swears he did? What motive could he have in not posting it? E. Mrs. Croft. Same as above. Who are Mr. and Mrs. Croft? Are they in hiding for some reason? And if so, what reason? Have they any connection with the Buckley family? F. Mrs. Rice. Was she really aware of the engagement between Nick and Michael Seaton? Did she merely guess it, or had she actually read the letters which passed between them? In that case, she would know Mademoiselle was Seaton's heir. Did she know that she herself was Mademoiselle's residuary legatee? This, I think, is likely. Mademoiselle would probably tell her so, adding perhaps that she would not get much out of it. Is there any truth in Commander Challenger's suggestion that Lazarus was attracted by Mademoiselle Nick? This might explain a certain lack of cordiality between the two friends, which seems to have shown itself in the last few months. Who is the boyfriend mentioned in her note as supplying the drug? Could this possibly be Jay? Why did she turn faint one day in this room? Was it something that had been said, or was it something she saw? Is her account of the telephone message asking her to buy chocolates correct, or is it a deliberate lie? What did she mean by, I can understand the other, but not this? If she is not herself guilty, what knowledge has she got that she is keeping to herself? You perceive, said Poirot, suddenly breaking off, that the questions concerning Madame Rice are almost innumerable. From beginning to end, she is an enigma. And that forces me to a conclusion. Either Madame Rice is guilty, or she knows, or shall we say thinks she knows, who is guilty. But is she right? Does she know, or does she merely suspect? And how is it possible to make her speak? He sighed. Well, I will go on with my list of questions. G. Mr. Lazarus. Curious. There are practically no questions to ask concerning him except the crude one. Did he substitute the poisoned sweets? Otherwise, I find only one totally irrelevant question. But I have put it down. Why did Monsieur Lazarus offer £50 for a picture that was only worth 20? He wanted to do Nick a good turn, I suggested. He would not do it that way. He is a dealer. He does not buy to sell at a loss. If he wished to be amiable, he would lend her money as a private individual. Well, it can't have any bearing on the crime, anyway. No, that is true, but all the same, I should like to know. I am a student of the psychology, you understand. Now, we come to H. H. Commander Challenger. Why did Mademoiselle Nick tell him she was engaged to someone else? What necessitated her having to tell him that? She told no one else. Had he proposed to her? What are his relations with his uncle? His uncle, Poirot? Yes, the doctor. That rather questionable character. Did any private news of Michael Seaton's death come through to the Admiralty before it was announced publicly? I don't quite see what you're driving at, Poirot. Even if Challenger knew beforehand about Seaton's death, It does not seem to get us anywhere. It provides no earthly motive for killing the girl he loved. I quite agree. What you say is perfectly reasonable. But these are just things I should like to know. I am still the dog, you see, nosing about for the things that are not very nice. Monsieur Vyse. Why did he say what he did about his cousin's fanatical devotion to End House? What possible motive could he have in saying that? Did he, or did he not, receive the will? Is he in fact an honest man, or is he not an honest man? And now, J. Eh bien, J is what I put down before, a giant question mark. Is there such a person, or is there not? Mon Dieu, my friend. What have you? I had started from my chair with a sudden shriek. With a shaking hand, I pointed at the window. A face, Poirot, I cried. A face, pressed against the glass. A dreadful face. It's gone now, but I saw it. Poirot strode to the window and pushed it open. He leant out. There is no one there now, he said thoughtfully. You are sure you did not imagine it, Hastings? Quite sure. It was a horrible face. There is a balcony, of course. Anyone could reach there quite easily if they wanted to hear what we were saying. When you say a dreadful face, Hastings, just what do you mean? A white, staring face, hardly human. Mon ami, that is the fever. A face, yes. An unpleasant face, yes, but a face hardly human? No. What you saw was the effect of a face pressed closely against the glass. That, allied to the shock of seeing it there at all. It was a dreadful face, I said obstinately. It was not the face of anyone you know. No, indeed. It might have been, though. I doubt if you would recognize it under these circumstances. I wonder now. Yes, I very much wonder. He gathered up his papers thoughtfully. One thing at least is to the good. If the owner of that face overheard our conversation, we did not mention that Mademoiselle Nick was alive and well. Whatever else our visitor may have heard, that at least escaped him. But surely, I said, the results of this brilliant manoeuvre of yours have been slightly disappointing up to date. Nick is dead, and no startling developments have occurred. I do not expect them yet awhile. 24 hours, I said. Mon ami, tomorrow, if I am not mistaken, certain things will arise. Otherwise, I am wrong from start to finish. There is the post, you see. I have hopes of tomorrow's post. I awoke in the morning feeling weak, but with the fever abated. I also felt hungry. Poirot and I had breakfast served in our sitting room. Well, I said maliciously as he sorted his letters, has the post done what you expected of it? Poirot, who had just opened 2 envelopes, which patently contained bills, did not reply. I thought he looked rather cast down, and not his usual cock-a-hoop self. I opened my own mail. The first was a notice of a spiritualist meeting. If all else fails, we must go to the spiritualists, I remarked. I often wonder that more tests of this kind aren't made. The spirit of the victim comes back and names the murderer. That would be a proof. It would hardly help us, said Poirot absently. I doubt if Maggie Buckley knew whose hand it was shot her down. Even if she could speak, she would have nothing of value to tell us. Tiens, that is odd. What is? You talk of the dead speaking, and at that moment I opened this letter. He tossed it across to me. It was from Mrs. Buckley, and ran as follows. Langley Rectory. Dear Monsieur Poirot, on my return here I found a letter written by my poor child on her arrival at St. Lou. There is nothing in it of interest to you, I am afraid, but I thought perhaps you would care to see it. Thanking you for your kindness, yours sincerely, Jean Buckley. The enclosure brought a lump to my throat. It was so terribly commonplace and so completely untouched by any apprehension of tragedy. Dear Mother, I arrived safely. Quite a comfortable journey. Only 2 people in the carriage all the way to Exeter. It is lovely weather here. Nick seems very well and gay. A little restless, perhaps, but I cannot see why she should have telegraphed for me in the way that she did. Tuesday would have done just as well. No more now. We are going to have tea with some neighbours. They're Australians and have rented the lodge. Nick says they're kind, but rather awful. Mrs. Rice and Mr. Lazarus are coming to stay. He is the art dealer. I will post this in the box by the gate. Then it will catch the post. We'll write tomorrow. Your loving daughter, Maggie. P.S. Nick says there is a reason for her wire. She will tell me after tea. She is very queer and jumpy. The voice of the dead, said Poirot quietly, and it tells us nothing. The box by the gate, I remarked idly. That's where Croft said he posted the will. Said so. Yes, I wonder. How I wonder. There is nothing else of interest among your letters? Nothing. Hastings, I am very unhappy. I am in the dark, still in the dark. I comprehend nothing. At that moment the telephone rang. Poirot went to it. Immediately I saw a change come over his face. His manner was very restrained. Nevertheless, he could not disguise from my eyes his intense excitement. His own contributions to the conversation were entirely non-committal, so that I could not gather what it was all about. Presently, however, with a "Très bien, je vous remercie," he put back the receiver and came back to where I was sitting. His eyes were sparkling with excitement. "Mon ami," he said, "what did I tell you? Things have begun to happen." "What was it?" "That was Monsieur Charles Vyse on the telephone. He informs me that this morning through the post he has received a will signed by his cousin Miss Buckley and dated the 25th of February last." "What? The will? Évidemment. It has turned up just at the right moment, n'est-ce pas? Do you think he's speaking the truth? Or do I think that he has had the will all along? Is that what you would say? Well, it is all a little curious, but one thing is certain. I told you that if Mademoiselle Nick were supposed to be dead, we should have developments, and sure enough, here they are." "Extraordinary," I said. "You were right. I suppose this is the will making Frederica Rice residuary legatee. Monsieur Vyse said nothing about the contents of the will. He was far too correct. But there seems very little reason to doubt that this is the same will. It is witnessed, he tells me, by Ellen Wilson and her husband." "So, we're back at the old problem," I said. "Frederica Rice, the enigma." "Frederica Rice," I murmured inconsequently. "It's a pretty name." "Prettier than what her friends call her. Freddy." He made a face. "C'est pas joli for a young lady." "There aren't many abbreviations of Frederica," I said. "It's not like Margaret, where you can have half a dozen. Maggie, Margot, Madge, Peggy." "True. Well, Hastings, are you happier now that things have begun to happen?" "Oh, yes, of course." "Tell me, did you expect this to happen?" "No, not exactly. I had formulated nothing very precise to myself. All I had said was that given a certain result, the causes of that result must make themselves evident." "Yes," I said respectfully. "What was it that I was going to say just as that telephone rang?" mused Poirot. "Oh, yes, that letter from Mademoiselle Maggie. I wanted to look at it once again. I have an idea in the back of my mind that something in it struck me as rather curious." I picked it up from where I had tossed it and handed it to him. He read it over to himself. I moved about the room, looking out of the window and observing the yachts racing on the bay. Suddenly, an exclamation startled me. I turned round. Poirot was holding his head in his hands and rocking himself to and fro, apparently in an agony of woe. "Oh," he groaned, "but I have been blind! What's the matter?" "Complex, I have said. Complicated, mais non. Of a simplicity extreme, and miserable one that I am, I saw nothing. Good gracious, Poirot, what is this light that has suddenly burst upon you? Wait, do not speak. I must arrange my ideas, rearrange them in the light of this discovery so stupendous." Seizing his list of questions, he ran over them silently, his lips moving busily. Once or twice he nodded his head emphatically. Then he laid them down, and leaning back in his chair, he shut his eyes. I thought at last that he had gone to sleep. Suddenly, he sighed and opened his eyes. "But yes," he said, "it all fits in. All the things that have puzzled me, All the things that have seemed to me a little unnatural. They all have their place. You mean you know everything? Nearly everything. All that matters. In some respects, I have been right in my deductions. In other ways, ludicrously far from the truth. But now it is all clear. I shall send today a telegram asking 2 questions. But the answers to them I know already. I know here. He tapped his forehead. And when you receive the answers? I asked curiously. He sprang to his feet. My friend, do you remember that Mademoiselle Nick said she wanted to stage a play at End House? Tonight, we stage such a play in End House. But it will be a play produced by Hercule Poirot. Mademoiselle Nick will have a part to play in it. He grinned suddenly. You comprehend, Hastings. There will be a ghost in this play. Yes, a ghost. End House has never seen a ghost. It will have one tonight. No. As I try to ask a question, I will say no more. Tonight, Hastings, we will produce our comedy and reveal the truth. But now there is much to do. Much to do. He hurried from the room. Chapter 19. Poirot produces a play. It was a curious gathering that met that night at End House. I had hardly seen Poirot all day. He had been out for dinner, but he had left a message that I was to be at End House at 9 o'clock. Evening dress, he had added, was not necessary. The whole thing was like a rather ridiculous dream. On arrival, I was ushered into the dining room, and when I looked round, I realized that every person on Poirot's list, from A to I, was present. J was necessarily excluded, there being no such person. Even Mrs. Croft was there, in a kind of invalid chair. She smiled and nodded at me. "This is a surprise, isn't it?" she said cheerfully. "It makes a change for me, I must say. I think I shall try and get out now and again. All Monsieur Poirot's idea. Come and sit by me, Captain Hastings. Somehow I feel this is rather a gruesome business. But Mr. Vyse made a point of it." "Mr. Vyse?" I said, rather surprised. Charles Vyse was standing by the mantelpiece. Poirot was beside him, talking earnestly to him in an undertone. I looked round the room. Yes, they were all there. After showing me in, I had been a minute or two late, Ellen had taken her place on a chair just beside the door. On another chair, sitting painfully straight and breathing hard, was her husband. The child, Alfred, squirmed uneasily between his father and mother. The rest sat round the dining table. Frederica in her black dress, Lazarus beside her, George Challenger, and Croft on the other side of the table. I sat a little away from it, near Mrs. Croft. And now Charles Vyse, a final nod of the head, took his place at the head of the table, and Poirot slipped unobtrusively into a seat next to Lazarus. Clearly the producer, as Poirot had styled himself, did not propose to take a prominent part in the play. Charles Vyse was apparently in charge of the proceedings. I wondered what surprises Poirot had in store for him. The young lawyer cleared his throat and stood up. He looked just the same as ever, impassive, formal, and unemotional. "This is rather an unconventional gathering we have here tonight," he said, "but the circumstances are very peculiar. I refer, of course, to the circumstances surrounding the death of my cousin, Miss Buckley. There will have, of course, to be an autopsy. There seems to be no doubt that she met her death by poison, and that poison was administered with the intent to kill. This is police business, and I need not go into it. The police would doubtless prefer me not to do so. In an ordinary case, the will of a deceased person is read after the funeral, but in deference to Monsieur Poirot's special wish, I am proposing to read it before the funeral takes place. In fact, I am proposing to read it here and now. That is why everyone has been asked to come here. As I said just now, the circumstances are unusual, and justify a departure from precedent. The will itself came into my possession in a somewhat unusual manner. Although dated last February, it only reached me by post this morning. However, it is undoubtedly in the handwriting of my cousin. I have no doubt on that point, and though a most informal document, it is properly attested." He paused and cleared his throat once more. Every eye was upon his face. From a long envelope in his hand, he drew out an enclosure. It was, as we could see, an ordinary piece of end-house notepaper, with writing on it. "It is quite short," said Vyse. He made a suitable pause, then began to read. "This is the last will and testament of Magdala Buckley. I direct that all my funeral expenses should be paid, and I appoint my cousin Charles Vyse as my executor. I leave everything of which I die possessed to Mildred Croft, in grateful recognition of the services rendered by her to my father, Philip Buckley, which services nothing can ever repay. Signed, Magdala Buckley. Witnesses, Ellen Wilson, William Wilson." I was dumbfounded. So, I think, was everyone else. Only Mrs. Croft nodded her head in quiet understanding. "It's true," she said quietly. "Not that I ever meant to let on about it. Philip Buckley was out in Australia, and if it hadn't been for me, well, I'm not going into that. A secret it's been, and a secret it had better remain. She knew about it, though. Nick did, I mean. Her father must have told her. We came down here because we wanted to have a look at the place. I'd always been curious about this end house Philip Buckley talked of, and that dear girl knew all about it, and couldn't do enough for us. Wanted us to come and live with her, she did, but we wouldn't do that. And so she insisted on our having the lodge, and not a penny of rent would she take. We pretended to pay it, of course, so as not to cause talk, but she handed it back to us. And now this. Well, if anyone says there's no gratitude in the world, I'll tell them they're wrong. This proves it." There was still an amazed silence. Poirot looked at Vyse. "Had you any idea of this?" Vyse shook his head. "I knew Philip Buckley had been in Australia, but I never heard any rumours of a scandal there." He looked inquiringly at Mrs. Croft. She shook her head. "No, you won't get a word out of me. I never have said a word, and I never shall. The secret goes to the grave with me." Vyse said nothing. He sat quietly, tapping the table with a pencil. "I presume, Monsieur Vyse," Poirot leaned forward, "that as next of kin you could contest that will. There is, I understand, a vast fortune at stake, which was not the case when the will was made." Vyse looked at him coldly. "The will is perfectly valid. I should not dream of contesting my cousin's disposal of her property." "You're an honest fellow," said Mrs. Croft approvingly, "and I'll see you don't lose by it." Charles sank a little from this well-meant but slightly embarrassing remark. "Well, mother," said Mr. Croft, with an elation he could not quite keep out of his voice, "this is a surprise. Nick didn't tell me what she was doing." "The dear, sweet girl," murmured Mrs. Croft, putting her handkerchief to her eyes. "Oh, I wish she could look down and see us now. Perhaps she does. Who knows?" "Perhaps," agreed Poirot. Suddenly, an idea seemed to strike him. He looked round. "An idea. We are all here seated round the table. Let us hold a séance." "A séance?" said Mrs. Croft, somewhat shocked. "But surely—" Yes, it will be most interesting. Hastings here has pronounced mediumistic powers." Why fix on me, I thought. To get through a message from the other world, the opportunity is unique. I feel the conditions are propitious. You feel the same, Hastings? "Oh, yes," I said resolutely, playing up. "Good. I knew it. Quick! The lights!" In another minute he had risen and switched them off. The whole thing had been rushed on the company before they had had the energy to protest, had they wanted to do so. As a matter of fact, they were, I think, still dazed with astonishment over the will. The room was not quite dark. The curtains were drawn back, and the window was open, for it was a hot night, and through those windows came a faint light. After a minute or two, as we sat in silence, I began to be able to make out the faint outlines of the furniture. I wondered very much what I was supposed to do, and cursed Poirot heartily for not having given me my instructions beforehand. However, I closed my eyes and breathed in a rather stertorous manner. Presently, Poirot rose and tiptoed to my chair. Then, returning to his own, he murmured, "Yes, he is already in a trance. Soon things will begin to happen." There is something about sitting in the dark, waiting, that fills one with an unbearable apprehension. I know that I myself was a prey to nerves, and so, I was sure, was everyone else. And yet I had at least an idea of what was about to happen. I knew the one vital fact that no one else knew. And yet, in spite of all that, my heart leapt into my mouth as I saw the dining-room door slowly opening. It did so quite soundlessly. It must have been oiled. And the effect was horribly grisly. It swung slowly open. And for a minute or two that was all. With its opening, a cold blast of air seemed to enter the room. It was, I suppose, a common or garden draught, owing to the open window, but it felt like the icy chill mentioned in all the ghost stories I had ever read. And then we all saw it. Framed in the doorway was a white, shadowy figure, Nick Buckley. She advanced slowly and noiselessly, with a kind of floating, ethereal motion that certainly conveyed the impression of nothing human. I realized then what an actress the world had missed. Nick had wanted to play a part at End House. Now she was playing it, and I felt convinced that she was enjoying herself to the core. She did it perfectly. She floated forward into the room, and the silence was broken. There was a gasping cry from the invalid chair beside me, a kind of gurgle from Mr. Croft, a startled oath from Challenger. Charles Vyse drew back his chair, I think. Lazarus leaned forward. Frederica alone made no sound or movement. And then a scream rent the room. Ellen sprang up from her chair. "It's her!" she shrieked. "She's come back! She's walking! Them that's murdered always walks! It's her! It's her!" And then, with a click, the lights went on. I saw Poirot standing by them, the smile of the ringmaster on his face. Nick stood in the middle of the room in her white draperies. It was Frederica who spoke first. She stretched out an unbelieving hand, touched her friend. "Nick," she said, You're real." It was almost a whisper. Nick laughed. She advanced. "Yes," she said, "I'm real enough. Thank you so much for what you did for my father, Mrs. Croft, but I'm afraid you won't be able to enjoy the benefit of that will just yet." "Oh, my God!" gasped Mrs. Croft. "Oh, my God!" She twisted to and fro in her chair. "Take me away, Bert! Take me away! It was all a joke, my dear! All a joke! That's all it was, honest!" "A queer sort of joke," said Nick. The door had opened again, and a man had entered so quietly that I had not heard him. To my surprise, I saw that it was Japp. He exchanged a quick nod with Poirot, as though satisfying him of something. Then his face suddenly lit up, and he took a step forward towards the squirming figure in the invalid chair. "Hello, hello, hello," he said. "What's this? An old friend. Millie Merton, I declare. And at your old tricks again, my dear." He turned round in an explanatory way to the company, disregarding Mrs. Croft's shrill protests. "Cleverest forger we've ever had, Millie Merton. We knew there'd been an accident to the car they made their last getaway in. But there, even an injury to the spine wouldn't keep Millie from her tricks. She's an artist, she is." "Was that will a forgery?" said Vyse. He spoke in tones of amazement. "Of course it was a forgery," said Nick scornfully. "You don't think I'd make a silly will like that, do you? I left you End House, Charles, and everything else to Frederica." She crossed as she spoke and stood by her friend. And just at that moment, it happened. A spurt of flame from the window, and the hiss of a bullet, then another, and the sound of a groan and a fall outside, and Frederica on her feet with a thin trickle of blood running down her arm. Chapter 20. J. It was all so sudden that for a moment no one knew what had happened. Then, with a violent exclamation, Poirot ran to the window. Challenger was with him. A moment later they reappeared, carrying with them the limp body of a man. As they lowered him carefully into a big leather armchair and his face came into view, I uttered a cry. The face! The face at the window! It was the man I had seen looking in on us the previous evening. I recognized him at once. I realized that when I had said he was hardly human, I had exaggerated, as Poirot had accused me of doing. Yet there was something about his face that justified my impression. It was a lost face, the face of one removed from ordinary humanity. White, weak, depraved, it seemed a mere mask, as though the spirit within had fled long ago. Down the side of it there trickled a stream of blood. Frederica came slowly forward, till she stood by the chair. Poirot intercepted her. "You are hurt, madame?" She shook her head. "The bullet grazed my shoulder. That is all." She put him aside with a gentle hand and bent down. The man's eyes opened, and he saw her looking down at him. "I've done for you this time, I hope," he said in a low, vicious snarl, and then, his voice changing suddenly till it sounded like a child's, "Oh, Freddie, I didn't mean it. I didn't mean it. You've always been so decent to me." "It's all right." She knelt down beside him. "I didn't mean—" His head dropped. The sentence was never finished. Frederica looked up at Poirot. "Yes, madame, he is dead," he said gently. She rose slowly from her knees and stood looking down at him. With one hand she touched his forehead, pitifully it seemed. Then she sighed and turned to the rest of us. "He was my husband," she said quietly. "Jay," I murmured. Poirot caught my remark and nodded a quick assent. "Yes," he said softly. "Always I felt that there was a J. I said so from the beginning, did I not?" "He was my husband," said Frederica again. Her voice was terribly tired. She sank into a chair that Lazarus brought for her. "I might as well tell you everything now. He was completely debased. He was a drug fiend. He taught me to take drugs. I've been fighting the habit ever since I left him. I think, at last, I'm nearly cured. But it has been difficult, oh, so horribly difficult. Nobody knows how difficult. I could never escape from him. He used to turn up and demand money, with threats, a kind of blackmail. If I did not give him money, he would shoot himself. That was always his threat. Then he took to threatening to shoot me. He was not responsible. He was mad, crazy. I suppose it was he who shot Maggie Buckley. He didn't mean to shoot her, of course. He must have thought it was me. I ought to have said, I suppose, but after all, I wasn't sure, and those queer accidents Nick had, that made me feel that perhaps it wasn't him after all. It might have been someone quite different. And then one day, I saw a bit of his handwriting on a torn piece of paper on Monsieur Poirot's table. It was part of a letter he had sent me. I knew then that Monsieur Poirot was on the track. Since then I felt that it was only a matter of time. But I don't understand about the sweets. He wouldn't have wanted to poison Nick. And anyway, I don't see how he could have had anything to do with that. I've puzzled and puzzled. She put both hands to her face, then took them away and said with a queer, pathetic finality, "That's all." Chapter 21. The Person K. Lazarus came quickly to her side. "My dear," he said, "my dear." Poirot went to the sideboard, poured out a glass of wine and brought it to her, standing over her while she drank it. She handed the glass back to him and smiled. "I'm all right now," she said. What had we better do next?" She looked at Japp, but the inspector shook his head. "I'm on holiday, Mrs. Rice. Just obliging an old friend, that's all I'm doing. The St. Lou police are in charge of the case." She looked at Poirot. "And Monsieur Poirot is in charge of the St. Lou police?" "Ah, quelle idée, madame! I am merely a humble adviser." "Monsieur Poirot," said Nick, "can't we hush it up?" "You wish that, mademoiselle?" "Yes. After all, I'm the person most concerned, and there will be no more attacks on me, now." "No, that is true. There will be no more attacks on you now." "You're thinking of Maggie, but, Monsieur Poirot, nothing will bring Maggie back to life again. If you make all this public, you'll only bring a terrible lot of suffering and publicity on Frederica, and she hasn't deserved it." "You say she has not deserved it?" "Of course she hasn't. I told you right at the beginning that she had a brute of a husband. You've seen tonight what he was. Well, he's dead. Let that be the end of things. Let the police go on looking for the man who shot Maggie. They just won't find him, that's all." "So that is what you say, mademoiselle. Hush it all up." "Yes, please. Oh, please, please, dear Monsieur Poirot." Poirot looked round slowly. "What do you all say?" Each spoke in turn. "I agree," I said, as Poirot looked at me. "I, too," said Lazarus. "Best thing to do," from Challenger. "Let's forget everything that's passed in this room tonight." This very determinedly from Croft. "You would say that," interpolated Japp. "Don't be hard on me, dearie," his wife sniffed to Nick, who looked at her scornfully but made no reply. "Ellen?" "Me and William won't say a word, sir. Least said, soonest mended." "And you, Monsieur Vyse?" "A thing like this can't be hushed up," said Charles Vyse. "The facts must be made known in the proper quarter." "Charles!" cried Nick. "I'm sorry, dear. I look at it from the legal aspect." Poirot gave a sudden laugh. "So, you are 7-1. The good Japp is neutral." "I'm on holiday," said Japp with a grin. "I don't count." 7-1. Only Monsieur Vyse holds out, on the side of law and order. You know, Monsieur Vyse, you are a man of character." Vyse shrugged his shoulders. "The position is quite clear. There's only one thing to do." "Yes, you are an honest man. Eh bien, I too range myself on the side of the minority. I too am for the truth." "Monsieur Poirot," cried Nick. "Mademoiselle, you dragged me into the case. I came into it at your wish. You cannot silence me now." He raised a threatening forefinger in a gesture that I knew well. "Sit down, all of you, and I will tell you the truth." Silenced by his imperious attitude, we sat down meekly and turned attentive faces towards him. "Écoutez. I have a list here, a list of persons connected with the crime. I numbered them with the letters of the alphabet, including the letter J. J stood for a person unknown, linked to the crime by one of the others. I did not know who J was until tonight, but I knew that there was such a person. The events of tonight have proved that I was right. But yesterday, I suddenly realized that I had made a grave error. I had made an omission. I added another letter to my list, the letter K." "Another person unknown?" asked Vyse, with a slight sneer. "Not exactly. I adopted J as the symbol for a person unknown. Another person unknown would merely be another J. K has a different significance. It stands for a person who should have been included in the original list, but who was overlooked." He bent over Frederica. "Reassure yourself, madame. Your husband was not guilty of murder. It was the person K who shot Mademoiselle Maggie." She stared. "But who is K?" Poirot nodded to Japp. He stepped forward and spoke in tones reminiscent of the days when he had given evidence in police courts. "Acting on information received, I took up a position here early in the evening, having been introduced secretly into the house by Monsieur Poirot. I was concealed behind the curtains in the drawing-room. When everyone was assembled in this room, a young lady entered the drawing-room and switched on the light. She made her way to the fireplace and opened a small recess in the panelling that appeared to be operated with a spring. She took from the recess a pistol. With this in her hand, she left the room. I followed her, and opening the door a crack, I was able to observe her further movements. Coats and wraps had been left in the hall by the visitors on arrival. The young lady carefully wiped the pistol with a handkerchief and then placed it in the pocket of a grey wrap, the property of Mrs. Rice. A cry burst from Nick. "This is untrue, every word of it!" Poirot pointed a hand at her. "Voilà!" he said. "The person K. It was Mademoiselle Nick who shot her cousin, Maggie Buckley." "Are you mad?" cried Nick. "Why should I kill Maggie? In order to inherit the money left to her by Michael Seton. Her name too was Magdala Buckley, and it was to her he was engaged, not you." You! She stood there trembling, unable to speak. Poirot turned to Jap. "You telephoned to the police?" "Yes, they're waiting in the hall now. They've got the warrant." "You're all mad!" cried Nick contemptuously. She moved swiftly to Frederica's side. "Freddie, give me your wristwatch. As a souvenir, will you?" Slowly, Frederica unclasped the jewelled watch from her wrist and handed it to Nick. "Thanks. And now I suppose we must go through with this perfectly ridiculous comedy." "The comedy you planned and produced in End House, yes. But you should not have given the star part to Hercule Poirot. That, mademoiselle, was your mistake. Your very grave mistake." Chapter 22. The end of the story. "You want me to explain?" Poirot looked round with a gratified smile and the air of mock humility I knew so well. We had moved into the drawing-room, and our numbers had lessened. The domestics had withdrawn tactfully, and the Crofts had been asked to accompany the police. Frederica, Lazarus, Challenger, Vyse, and I remained. Eh bien, I confess it. I was fooled completely and absolutely. The little Nick, she had me where she wanted me, as your idiom so well expresses it. Ah, madame, when you said that your friend was a clever little liar, how right you were. How right." "Nick always told lies," said Frederica composedly. "That's why I didn't really believe in those marvellous escapes of hers. And I, imbecile that I was, did." "Well, didn't they really happen?" I asked. I was, I admit, still hopelessly confused. "They were invented very cleverly, to give just the impression they did." "Well, what was that?" "They gave the impression that Mademoiselle Nick's life was in danger. But I will begin earlier than that. I will tell you the story as I have pieced it out, not as it came to me imperfectly and in flashes. At the beginning of the business, then, we have this girl, this Nick Buckley, young and beautiful, unscrupulous, and passionately and fanatically devoted to her home." Charles Vyse nodded. "I told you that, and you were right. Mademoiselle Nick loved End House, but she had no money. The house was mortgaged. She wanted money. She wanted it feverishly, and she could not get it. She meets this young Seton at Le Touquet. He is attracted by her. She knows that in all probability he is his uncle's heir, and that uncle is worth millions. Good. Her star is in the ascendant, she thinks. But he is not really seriously attracted. He thinks her good fun, that is all. They meet at Scarborough. He takes her up in his machine, and then the catastrophe occurs. He meets Maggie, and he falls in love with her at first sight. Mademoiselle Nick is dumbfounded. Her cousin Maggie, whom she has never considered pretty? But to young Seton she is different. The one girl in the world for him. They become secretly engaged. Only one person knows, has to know. That person is Mademoiselle Nick. The poor Maggie, she is glad there is one person she can talk to. Doubtless she reads to her cousin parts of her fiancé's letters. So it is that Mademoiselle gets to hear of the will. She pays no attention to it at the time, but it remains in her mind. Then comes the sudden and unexpected death of Sir Matthew Seton, and hard upon that, the rumours of Michael Seton's being missing. And straightway, an outrageous plan comes into our young lady's head. Seton does not know that her name is Magdala also. He only knows her as Nick. His will is clearly quite informal, a mere mention of a name. But in the eyes of the world, Seton is her friend. It is with her that his name has been coupled. If she were to claim to be engaged to him, no one would be surprised. But to do that successfully, Maggie must be out of the way. Time is short. She arranges for Maggie to come and stay in a few days' time. Then she has her escapes from death. The picture whose cord she cuts through. The brake of the car that she tampers with. The boulder that perhaps was natural, and she merely invented the story of being underneath on the path. And then she sees my name in the paper. I told you, Hastings. Everyone knew Hercule Poirot. And she has the audacity to make me an accomplice. The bullet through the hat that falls at my feet. Oh, the pretty comedy. And I am taken in. I believe in the peril that menaces her. Bon. She has got a valuable witness on her side. I play into her hands by asking her to send for a friend. She seizes the chance and sends for Maggie to come a day earlier. How easy the crime is, actually. She leaves us at the dinner table, and after hearing on the wireless that Seton's death is a fact, she starts to put her plan into action. She has plenty of time then to take Seton's letters to Maggie, look through them, and select the few that will answer her purpose. These she places in her own room. Then later she and Maggie leave the fireworks and go back to the house. She tells her cousin to put on her shawl. Then, stealing out after her, she shoots her. Quick, into the house, the pistol concealed in the secret panel, of whose existence she thinks nobody knows. Then upstairs. There she waits till voices are heard. The body is discovered. It is her cue. Down she rushes, and out through the window. How well she played her part, magnificently. Oh, yes, she staged a fine drama here. The maid, Ellen, said this was an evil house. I am inclined to agree with her. It was from the house that Mademoiselle Nick took her inspiration. But those poisoned sweets, said Frederica, I still don't understand about that. It was all part of the same scheme. Do you not see that if Nick's life was attempted after Maggie was dead, that absolutely settled the question that Maggie's death had been a mistake? When she thought the time was ripe, she rang up Madame Rice and asked her to get her a box of chocolates. Oh, then it was her voice. But yes, how often the simple explanation is the true one, n'est-ce pas? She made her voice sound a little different, that was all, so that you might be in doubt when questioned. Then, when the box arrived, again, how simple. She fills 3 of the chocolates with cocaine. She had cocaine with her, cleverly concealed, eats one of them, and is ill, but not too ill. She knows very well how much cocaine to take and just what symptoms to exaggerate. And the card, my card. Ah, sapristi, she has a nerve. It was my card. The one I sent with the flowers. Simple, was it not? Yes, but it had to be thought of. There was a pause, and then Frederica asked, Why did she put the pistol in my coat? I thought you would ask me that, madame. It was bound to occur to you in time. Tell me, had it ever entered your head that Mademoiselle Nick no longer liked you? Did you ever feel that she might hate you? It's difficult to say, said Frederica slowly. We lived an insincere life. She used to be fond of me. Tell me, Monsieur Lazarus, it is not a time for false modesty, you understand. Was there ever anything between you and her? No. Lazarus shook his head. I was attracted to her at one time, and then, I don't know why, I went off her. Ah, said Poirot, nodding his head sagely. That was her tragedy. She attracted people, and then they went off her. Instead of liking her better and better, you fell in love with her friend. She began to hate Madame who had a rich friend behind her. Last winter, when she made a will, she was fond of Madame. Later, it was different. She remembered that will. She did not know that Croft had suppressed it, that it had never reached its destination. Madame, or so the world would say, had got a motive for desiring her death. So it was to Madame she telephoned, asking her to get the chocolates. Tonight the will would have been read, naming Madame her residuary legatee. And then the pistol would be found in her coat, the pistol with which Maggie Buckley was shot. If Madame found it, she might incriminate herself by trying to get rid of it. "She must have hated me," murmured Frederica. "Yes, Madame. You had what she had not, the knack of winning love and keeping it." "I'm rather dense," said Challenger, "but I haven't quite fathomed the will business yet." "No? That's a different business altogether. A very simple one. The Crofts are lying low down here. Mademoiselle Nick has to have an operation. She has made no will. The Crofts see a chance. They persuade her to make one, and take charge of it for the post. Then, if anything happens to her, if she dies, they produce a cleverly forged will, leaving the money to Mrs. Croft, with a reference to Australia and Philip Buckley, whom they know once visited the country. But Mademoiselle Nick has her appendix removed quite satisfactorily, so the forged will is no good. For the moment, that is. Then the attempts on her life begin. The Crofts are hopeful once more. Finally, I announce her death. The chance is too good to be missed. The forged will is immediately posted to Monsieur Vyse. Of course, to begin with, they naturally thought her much richer than she is. They knew nothing about the mortgage. "What I really want to know, Monsieur Poirot," said Lazarus, "is how you actually got wise to all this. When did you begin to suspect?" There I am ashamed. I was so long. There were things that worried me, yes, things that seemed not quite right. Discrepancies between what Mademoiselle Nick told me and what other people told me. Unfortunately, I always believed Mademoiselle Nick. And then suddenly, I got a revelation. Mademoiselle Nick made one mistake. She was too clever. When I urged her to send for a friend, she promised to do so, and suppressed the fact that she had already sent for Mademoiselle Maggie. It seemed to her less suspicious, but it was a mistake. For Maggie Buckley wrote a letter home immediately on arrival, and in it she used one innocent phrase that puzzled me. I don't see why Nick should have telegraphed for me the way she did. Tuesday would have done just as well. What did that mention of Tuesday mean? It could only mean one thing. Maggie had been coming to stay on Tuesday anyway. But in that case, Mademoiselle Nick had lied, or had at any rate suppressed the truth. And for the first time, I looked at her in a different light. I criticized her statements. Instead of believing them, I said, suppose this were not true. I remembered the discrepancies. How would it be if every time it was Mademoiselle Nick who was lying, and not the other person? I said to myself, let us be simple. What has really happened? And I saw that what had really happened was that Maggie Buckley had been killed. Just that. But who could want Maggie Buckley dead? And then I thought of something else. A few foolish remarks that Hastings had made not 5 minutes before. He had said that there were plenty of abbreviations for Margaret, Maggie, Margot, etc. And it suddenly occurred to me to wonder what was Mademoiselle Maggie's real name. Then, tout d'un coup, it came to me. Supposing her name was Magdala. It was a Buckley name. Mademoiselle Nick had told me so. 2 Magdala Buckleys. Supposing... In my mind, I ran over the letters of Michael Seaton's that I had read. Yes, there was nothing impossible. There was a mention of Scarborough, but Maggie had been in Scarborough with Nick. Her mother had told me so. and it explained one thing which had worried me. Why were there so few letters? If a girl keeps her love letters at all, she keeps all of them. Why select these few? Was there any peculiarity about them? And I remembered that there was no name mentioned in them. They all began differently, but they began with a term of endearment. Nowhere in them was there the name Nick. And there was something else, something that I ought to have seen at once, that cried the truth aloud. What was that? Why, this. Mademoiselle Nick underwent an operation for appendicitis on February 27th last. There is a letter of Michael Seaton's, dated March 2nd, and no mention of anxiety, of illness, or anything unusual. That ought to have shown me that the letters were written to a different person altogether. Then I went through a list of questions that I had made, and I answered them in the light of my new idea. In all but a few isolated questions, the result was simple and convincing. And I answered, too, another question, which I had asked myself earlier. Why did Mademoiselle Nick buy a black dress? The answer was that she and her cousin had to be dressed alike with the scarlet shawl as an additional touch. That was the true and convincing answer, not the other. A girl would not buy mourning before she knew her lover was dead. She would be unreal, unnatural. And so I, in turn, staged my little drama. And the thing I hoped for happened. Nick Buckley had been very vehement about the question of a secret panel. She had declared there was no such thing, but if there were, and I did not see why Ellen should have invented it, Nick must know of it. Why was she so vehement? Was it possible that she had hidden the pistol there, with the secret intention of using it to throw suspicion on somebody later? I let her see that appearances were very black against Madame. That was as she had planned. As I foresaw, she was unable to resist the crowning proof. Besides, it was safer for herself. That secret panel might be found by Ellen, and the pistol in it. We are all safely in here. She is waiting outside for her cue. It is absolutely safe, she thinks, to take the pistol from its hiding place and put it in Madame's coat. And so, at the last, she failed. Frederica shivered. "All the same," she said, "I'm glad I gave her my watch." "Yes, Madame." She looked up at him quickly. "You know about that, too." "What about Ellen?" I asked, breaking in. "Did she know or suspect anything?" "No." "I asked her. She told me that she decided to stay in the house that night because, in her own phrase, she thought something was up. Apparently Nick urged her to see the fireworks rather too decisively. She had fathomed Nick's dislike of Madame. She told me that she felt in her bones something was going to happen. But she thought it was going to happen to Madame. She knew Miss Nick's temper, she said, and she was always a queer little girl. "Yes," murmured Frederica. "Yes, let us think of her like that. A queer little girl. A queer little girl who couldn't help herself. I shall, anyway." Poirot took her hand and raised it gently to his lips. Charles Vyse stirred uneasily. "It's going to be a very unpleasant business," he said quietly. "I must see about some kind of defence for her, I suppose." "There will be no need, I think," said Poirot gently. "Not if I am correct in my assumptions." He turned suddenly on Challenger. "That's where you put the stuff, isn't it?" he said. "In those wristwatches." I, the sailor stammered, at a loss. "Do not try and deceive me with your hearty good-fellow manner. It has deceived Hastings, but it does not deceive me. You make a good thing out of it, do you not? The traffic in drugs. You and your uncle in Harley Street." "Monsieur Poirot!" Challenger rose to his feet. My little friend blinked up at him placidly. "You are the useful boyfriend. Deny it, if you like. But I advise you, if you do not want the facts put in the hands of the police, to go." And to my utter amazement, Challenger did go. He went from the room like a flash. I stared after him open-mouthed. Poirot laughed. "I told you so, mon ami. Your instincts are always wrong. C'est épatant." "Cocaine was in the wristwatch," I began. Yes, that is how Mademoiselle Nick had it with her so conveniently at the nursing home. And having finished her supply in the chocolate box, she asked Madame just now for hers, which was full." "Oh, you mean she can't do without it?" No. Mademoiselle Nick is not an addict. Sometimes for fun, that is all. But tonight, she needed it for a different purpose. It will be a full dose this time." "You mean—" I gasped. "It is the best way. Better than the hangman's rope. But psst, we must not say so before Monsieur Vyse, who is all for law and order. Officially, I know nothing. The contents of the wristwatch, it is the merest guess on my part." "Your guesses are always right, Monsieur Poirot," said Frederica. "I must be going," said Charles Vyse, cold disapproval in his attitude as he left the room. Poirot looked from Frederica to Lazarus. "You are going to get married, eh?" "As soon as we can." "And indeed, Monsieur Poirot," said Frederica, "I am not the drug-taker you think. I have cut myself down to a tiny dose. I think now, with happiness in front of me, I shall not need a wristwatch any more." "I hope you will have happiness, madame," said Poirot. "You have suffered a great deal. And in spite of everything you have suffered, you have still the quality of mercy in your heart." "I will look after her," said Lazarus. "My business is in a bad way, but I believe I shall pull through. And if I don't, well, Frederica does not mind being poor with me." She shook her head, smiling. "It is late," said Poirot, looking at the clock. We all rose. "We have spent a strange night in this strange house," Poirot went on. "It is, I think, as Ellen says, an evil house." He looked up at the picture of old Sir Nicholas. Then, with a sudden gesture, he drew Lazarus aside. "I ask your pardon, but of all my questions, there is one still unanswered. Tell me, why did you offer £50 for that picture? It would give me much pleasure to know, so as, you comprehend, to leave nothing unanswered." Lazarus looked at him with an impassive face for a minute or two. Then he smiled. "You see, Monsieur Poirot," he said, "I am a dealer." "Exactly. That picture is not worth a penny more than £20. I knew that if I offered Nick 50, she would immediately suspect it was worth more, and would get it valued elsewhere. Then she would find that I had offered her far more than it was worth. The next time I offered to buy a picture, she would not have got it valued." "Yes? And then?" "The picture on the far wall is worth at least £5,000, said Lazarus dryly. "Ah." Poirot drew a long breath. "Now I know everything," he said happily.